And we begin. We begin the journey. So we're still in Exodus chapter 12, and we're thinking about maybe this is related to Memorial Day. Okay. So if you ask yourself, let's say you're trying well, it's related to Memorial Day. It's also related to, I guess, the next holiday that's coming, Independence Day. So we're talking about you have a country, you create your independence, and you want people to be loyal to the idea, right? If people are going to enlist to protect the country and maybe give the the ultimate sacrifice. So what inspires them? So if you ask yourself, if you're Moses, and you ask yourself, what is it that it takes to create and ensure the continuation of the people you're creating, and not for just a few hundred years or a few decades, a few hundred years, but for thousands of years, what is it that you have to ensure? Do you need military might? Do you need fortifications? Do you need a piece of geography that will enhance your protection? And what's interesting is what Moshe keeps saying again and again in chapter 12 of Exodus is that it's telling the story, right? So what's going to defend freedom is what's the greatest defense of freedom is the storytelling, which doesn't seem like that's the most critical point. But telling the story is really the way of conveying to people what is it that you value, what is it, the contrast that we didn't always have it, and therefore the commitment to therefore defend it. So that's why in this, both in Exodus 12 and Exodus 13, again and again, Torah emphasizes your child will ask you and you'll tell the story. And we got into some of the specifics of which child is asking and the four sons. And Neil wanted to discuss the wicked son, which we can do a little bit today because it keeps coming back.
The transformation of the wicked son into the righteous son. Right.
That's one step. But that, yeah, I don't know if we'll talk about that today, but yeah, we want that as well. But the idea of the conversation and that the most important thing is the storytelling. And that's our might. What we pass on is what will keep us alive is the stories. I bought a book. I'm not sure I want to plug it yet, but I bought a book of how the Talmud will change your life. Leo Leibowitz, I think his name is, and he can speak. He's a speaker. He's the editor of Tablet magazine. Interesting guy. And at least in the introduction, the thesis is that basically the Jewish people are, um, at least in the Talmudic times, but throughout most of our history, we are basically a civilization that is basically we're losing. In other words, we are being oppressed and we're being exiled. So how do you survive as someone who is losing in the physical sense, right? So if you're the Roman Empire, you can last a few centuries. But if you're on the losing end, most cultures who lose are going to be wiped away. And the thesis is that you turn to conversation, and the Talmud is conversation and storytelling and conversation and interaction, intellectual interaction, and that's going to preserve the people, and that's what has preserved us as a people. So that emphasizes why in Exodus chapter 12, as in other places of the Torah, but it's specifically around the Egypt and the birth of our people at the Exodus of Egypt, again and again, is tell the story. So that's a little bit of getting into the spirit of the chapter and connecting it perhaps to what is it that we could do to preserve our values. And so sometimes because it's our values, we assume that it's obvious to the people around us and maybe obvious to our children. But the Torah says don't make any assumptions. Um, Especially when they're young, when they're around. Once they get older, they're out of the house. It's a different story. But especially when they're young, tell them, speak your values. Even in the Shema, we say every day, teach the Torah to your children, teach these words to your children, and speak of them. Right? What is the conversation about? And that's how you keep the ideas alive, and that's how you ensure that the teachings and the history and what we fought for, as in freedom, spiritual freedom, political freedom, how that will endure. So that's a little bit, like I said, intro to chapter chapter 12, which we are in the middle of. Now we'll share the screen and we'll see, get more specific. Okay. Okay, we talked about the verses up to this verse 22, well, we got to somewhere around um Tashbitu. We're at verse 15. We talked about this last week about make the chametz cease from your possession and what that means. So we spoke about that. Is it literal or is it in your mind? Is it in your awareness? So that's what we discussed last week. And then verse 20, finally, we finish again not to eat leavened bread. And verse 21 is Moses calling the elders of the Jewish people and telling them and repeating the commandments. So a lot of what happened in the beginning of chapter 12 is not being repeated, right? Because Moses summoned all the elders of the Israel and said to them, draw forth or buy for yourself sheep for your families and slaughter the Passover sacrifice. And he tells them what to do, put the blood on the doorpost, as we discussed. And verse 24, and you shall keep this matter as a statute for you and your children forever. Right? So right away, he's not just telling them what to do right now, but he's saying this Paschal lamb is something we're going to do for going forward. And then the idea is right away, tell the story. We're going to come to the land. It shall come to pass when you enter the land that the Lord your God will give you, as he spoke, that you shall observe this service. And it will come to pass if your children will say to you, what is this service to you? Your children will say to you, what is this service to you? So I just want to say that what's the Bahaya key? It will come to pass if. Key is a tricky word in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the word key has four meanings. They're translating as if your sons will say. It's possible. That's a legitimate translation, but it doesn't have to be if. It could also be when. In other words, it's almost inevitable that your children growing up in the land of Israel are not going to connect to those rituals and that mind frame of people who were in Egypt and are leaving Egypt. And that's normal. That's not surprising. So it's almost like there's going to be a gulf or a gap between the generations, and you have to bridge it by conversation, by talking, by sharing. So that's one point. And then we say, here's the question, here's the answer, verse 26 and 27. And like I mentioned before, there's the idea that there's four questions being asked in the context of the story of the Exodus in the Torah. And the sages say this is the wicked son. The first son we're talking about, the wicked son, or call it rebellious son. And then you could look at the specifics of the verses to figure out why the sages decided this is the rebellious son, and what is the response to the rebellious son, and is there any lessons for us? So just to reiterate something we always say, what does it mean that we read the Haggadah and the Haggadah says there are four sons, that the Torah speaks of four sons? Essentially, what it means is that there are four times in the Torah where the Torah says the same thing, which is tell the story your child will ask and you should respond. Where are those three times? Three times in this context of the actual story, once in Exodus 12 and twice in Exodus 13. And then once in Deuteronomy, when the story in Deuteronomy, when it's repeated, again, it says, your son will ask you, your child will ask you, and you respond. So why does this have to be reiterated four times? So the answer is because the Torah is telling you that there is no one child asking one question. There's at least four general categories, and every child you have to tailor the answer to that child. And that opens up a whole genre of interpretation of looking at these questions and saying, what is the question? What is the answer? Which category of question is this? And like I said, the first one is the sages believe is the rebellious son. This is it. And the question is, what is so rebellious about this? And also, how do you respond to the rebellious child? And the response in the Haggadah that the sages articulate is different than the response that you have in the Torah here. So that's also something we could analyze. So there's a lot to analyze, assuming this is interesting, because we have so much to talk about. But maybe we'll do a minute or two on this. The first thing is, this is a general question. I was once watching a lecture at a synagogue, and before the rabbi introduces the questions and answers, he says, here in this synagogue, we only have one rule about questions and answers. He says, what? He says, every question must have a question mark at the end, right? Because people get up to ask questions, and instead of asking a question, they make a statement. Statements are very good, but it's not for questions and answers. So why am I saying this? Because what's interesting about this question is The first question is it really a question? Why am I asking that? Because what does the verse say in 26? It will come to pass if your children will say to you, what is this service to you? So yes, here there is a question mark, but in the Hebrew, there's no question mark. Obviously, there's no punctuation. But yomru aleichem, your children will say to you. Now, what's interesting is that the other times when it says that the child will ask, it says ki yish'alcha, your son will ask. Here it doesn't say ask. Here it says say to you, which means there's two ways of asking a question. Sometimes a person asks a question because they're looking for the answer. So then you give the answer. But sometimes a child or anybody, an adult or anybody asks a question, and the point is not the information that they want to receive. The point is they're making a statement. They're saying, this is what I think. Now, it's totally fine for them to think that. The only thing is you have to realize that if someone's making a statement, maybe now is not the right time to start giving him the intricate details of the answer, because it's possible that they're not open to know the answer, right? What is a question? A question is, I want to understand. If I don't want to understand, then maybe now is not the right time, that you should try to explain it to me. So that's first problem with the question is it really a question? Right? And sometimes you read it in the English or the Hebrew, you're reading it fast. You don't realize that, but you realize, and you also have to have the big picture, which is contrast this with the other times where it says your son will ask. Like for example, in the next chapter, if you want to skip and just to point this out, if you don't trust me, which you should not, you should always check it up. Let's see if I could find it. And it shall come to pass if your son asks you in the future, your son will ask you. And then there's also in Deuteronomy, the other time it doesn't say your son will ask, it just says, you will tell your son. And over there, it's the one, that's why they say, in the beginning of chapter 13, this is the son who doesn't ask a question. So that's its own problems. But when you contrast chapter 13 and 12 regarding the question itself, you see that it's very clear that when it comes to chapter 12, it says, Yomru alechem b'nechem, your sons will tell you, right? V'haya, it will come to pass if your children will say to you. Say to you. So that's the first question. Is it really a question? And now the question is, okay, and then we can have to unpack this further. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please. You're on mute. We really want to hear what you have to say.
All right. What I find fascinating is this. The fact, I just looked it up. They did research at Stanford Graduate School, and they found that stories were 22 times more effective in conveying something to people in a meaningful way than facts. Now, the question is this. Does the Kabbalah talk specifically about the kinds of stories that specifically motivate people to change their behavior?
So that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think what is interesting about stories? Why is stories more interesting to people? Why does it grab people's attention? So that leads me to the broader question: is what is interesting? So you're a teacher, you have to ask that question, right?
All the time.
So you ask, what is interesting? So usually I look at a text and I say, I think this could be interesting. But a few weeks ago, I started asking myself, could you define what is interesting? In other words, that you can't just say this is what feels right. You have to be more scientific about it to say what is interesting. And I said, I can't be the first one to ask this question. So let's ask the internet. Now, instead of asking the internet, I asked AI. So maybe this is totally made up. So maybe it's wrong. I didn't have the time to further research, but at least preliminary, I can go back to my notes and look it up and further research. But I'll do this over the summer. We'll have time in August. But the question is what it makes things interesting to people. And what they came back with is there's some formula, which I forget who came up with the formula, but it was very interesting to me because I always struggle with this, especially with Talmud study. So the formula is like this. First of all, it has to be human interest. In other words, people are interested in other people. Okay. So if you tell me some abstract concept, maybe it's not that interesting. If you tell me if it's about people, it's interesting. So a story of a struggle, story of the Passover is a human interest story. Okay. People will connect to that. The next thing they say, and this is what I'm going to connect this back to our point here. The next thing they say is people like to see patterns. In other words, when you look at something that doesn't look like, it just looks like random, and then you find patterns. Finding patterns is pleasing to the mind. The mind likes it. It makes it feel good. It makes it happy. It triggers whatever has to be triggered to make us happy. The problem here is that you only have a small space because you have to have patterns and complexity. But if it's too complex, then people can't understand it. So you have to be in that zone where there are details, not too many details. There are details, and you're finding patterns within the complexity, but not too complex. So that's what they're thinking about. Why am I saying this? Because we talked about this in the beginning of this parsha, the portion of the third portion of Exodus, and there it talks about God says this is even before the Exodus when it comes to the seventh plague. I'm sorry, the eighth plague. God says, I'm going to bring one more plague. And he says, Lamanta Sapersha, you should tell the story. Tell the story and tell how I made a mockery of Egypt. And we mentioned that there was a commentary, I think it was Rabbi Shimshon Hirsch, if I'm not mistaken, who says that the word hitalalti, I made a mockery, has also another meaning. Another meaning is it's a plot. Alila is a plot. And basically he says, what is a story? A story is that you have random events, but you're threading a story between them. In other words, you're finding how all these seemingly random events make a cohesive story. And that's what a plot is, and that's what people find interesting, and that's really what life is about, because life could be a series of random events. And if you live life that way, not only is it random, but it's also you're being pulled in so many different directions because you're doing all kinds of different things. And part of living a meaningful life is being able to be a storyteller, of being the storyteller of your own story. But storyteller is not just you're passive and reporting on something that's happening, but it's actually the active awareness of seeing how everything that I'm doing is part of a cohesive whole. So that's the spiritual idea of storytelling. And I think that you're saying what kind of stories motivate people, I don't know, but I think that what kind of stories that people find interesting is and pleasing to the mind, assuming this is true. I personally, it sounds from my own experience, and it's intuitively it sounds like it could be right, but I think that the idea that for example something seemed random, but then I'm finding patterns and I see this purpose in what seemed to be random. I think that's the type of stories that people connect to for other people, but also in your own life. When you look back and you see certain patterns, it's very I don't know if pleasing is the right word, but it's very gratifying is the right word. But that's the types of things I think we like. But you're the psychologist and the psychiatrist. So why am I talking? I have no idea. I'm speaking as the layperson. Go ahead, Ben, please.
Yeah, I think that stories, are really powerful, and I think the most powerful one that is ones in movies that I mean, and almost a better way to think about it, because editing of a movie, what ties people together, what the kind of power that it evokes. I mean, Hitler certainly understood the power of film, in the mastery of propaganda film, but a movie that drags is not interesting to people, and a movie that's exciting can be interesting but feels shallow. And I think when you're trying to figure out what is interesting, looking at what makes a good movie a bad movie and what draws people in is probably more easier to analyze than a story, than other kinds of stories. But I could be wrong.
That's very interesting because movie is storytelling. I would just take, like I said, I'm not an expert in this, but I would just connect what you're saying to my point, which is that the author, what is propaganda? Propaganda, usually you take something that's true, maybe a detail that's true, but you blow it out of proportion. And you say this detail is the whole story, right? And then you play down other details. But the point is, in our life, we're the storyteller of our life. We decide what is important in our life. So, for example, you have a day, and this day you have one thing that went bad and one thing that went good, right? Now you're the storyteller. You have the lens of the camera. You're the director of the film. You decide where you're putting the lens on, how much attention you're giving to each event, and which events are you going to blow up. In other words, magnify in the pot, magnify, and that will catch your attention. And which events are you going to say, yeah, it was a necessary step, it was a distraction, but that doesn't define my day. So if we think about film, in other words, you have the camera, right? And you could decide to zoom out, to zoom in, and how much time each event gets, and how much and which angle you choose to look at the story. So I think that it is storytelling, but it's also spiritually speaking, how to live life. You can take lessons from storytelling in general, but even just a vision, even movie. In other words, movie making, there is visual because you actually have a camera, you have an eye. And I say, I'm going to decide. It's a visual. I could decide where I'm putting my camera. Of course, if you're sitting with a pen and paper, you can also. But there, it's more theoretical. With the camera, it's a visual. You could see where am I putting the lens and how far. What am I zooming in on? And there's
That's exactly what I was feeling, and you just hit on it when you said that that in a story, in a written word, it's more theoretical, whereas it's movies are so powerful because because you can zoom in, zoom out,
right.
yeah, and really define yourself much easier as to. I love that thing that you just said about the day. Well, you can zoom in on one part or zoom in on another, wide angle, narrow angle.
Yeah,
I don't know. I just think that when you get to the question of what is interesting, what makes something interesting, I think that thinking about it in terms of film is a kind of
I agree. I agree. But I also realize that when you're watching a film or when you're watching the news for that matter, and that's why watching the news is so dangerous, is because the reporter says, I'm just reporting the story. And it's never the case because you decide what you look on and what you highlight. So for example, if you think about something as simple as let's say crime, okay? So you say, okay, let's say this terror. So let's say I was in Israel when there was a tremendous amount of terror in the 2002, the Second Intifada. So if you just hear the story that you open up the radio and you say this explosion, that explosion, that explosion, you think that paints the picture, right? But that's only because the lens is only on those events. But if you're living there and you're living daily life, that is an important story, but it's only part of the story. But you have the broader story, so you understand that there's a lot more going on in this area than just this legitimate danger. But the person who's just hearing those details doesn't see the big picture. So in other words, it's always a question of hearing certain details, and the reporter has to paint a picture because if not, it's just abstract. But remembering it's only a detail. So does this really capture the whole story or not? So yes, I think it's storytelling and everything around us is storytelling, especially in the internet, especially in the modern world. But we have to think of ourselves as storytellers. And the most important story is the story of my own life. And how do I think about my existence right now? I have the lens, I have my camera. Where am I putting it? How much am I giving each scene? And from what lens am I what angle am I looking at it? So we're all filmmakers. Agreed. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
Rabbi, speaking of stories, when was it decided? Why was it decided? And why does it keep being decided that the most important story in Judaism was the Exodus? In
That's a
other
good
words,
question.
obviously that was a big deal way back when, but
Yeah.
now in 2026, the Exodus seems really very fanciful. And why is that told constantly on every Shabbat at every service, as if that is the key story that relates to man and God and the Jewish people?
So there's many ways to answer that question, and depending on which genre, in other words, depending on where you want the camera to be and why Judaism is meaningful to you, I'm sure, especially that we're 250 years from the founding of this country, I'm sure people will tell you that the history, the story of the Exodus is basically telling you the idea of freedom and protect your freedom and guard your freedom and fight for it. So that's a very relevant story in the political sense. But obviously, there's so many ways of reading the Torah, and certainly in the Hasidic world and the Kabbalistic world, the power of the story of the Exodus is personal freedom, personal redemption. You're not trapped by the limitations that society puts you in, that your parents told you about, that you put upon yourself, and the idea that no matter how powerful it seems that the constraints that are upon me because of my nature, because of my instincts, because of my habits, and the idea is at any point you can do the miraculous and break free. So Judaism is a very big believer in universal redemption. And we talked about that in the JLI on Wednesday night about the world is the history is linear. We're moving forward. We're going to get to a place of universal liberation. But just as important, and maybe more important, and maybe a step in the right direction, is personal liberation. I am free to break away from the patterns of the past, and that point is always relevant for everybody. And I don't know if there is a point that's more relevant than that. I don't know if there could be something more relevant than that. The idea that we are free to decide the next move, free from the baggage of our pasts. I'm sure in your practice, people come to you and say, I am the way I am because my grandmother looked at me and because of this happened and my friend was, and I was bullied in school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And your job, I think, well, I'm not going to speak for you, but I think that the job is, first of all, to understand and to heal and to connect, but also to empower. And they say that's very important, but that's part of you, part of your experience. But again, where's the lens? Where's the focus? It's a detail. It's an important detail. It's a critical detail. But if you're not defined, you cannot be defined by anything. You ultimately have the freedom to break free. And on a personal level, I don't think anything could be more empowering than that, or more important than that. And the ramifications for morality, for ethics, for personal growth, for personal well-being. I don't think there's another story as powerful. Yeah, back to the Bible.
Ned.
Back to the Bible. Okay. So the first thing we said is the question is, your son is going to ask you. Now, there's difference. There are different ways. There's different things we could do with this. I'm going to go to the one that I find interesting first, and then we'll do some other things, and then we can continue. The simple interpretation is that the child will ask a question or make a statement. You shall say. What does you shall say mean? Va'amartem, you shall say. And what are you saying? This Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians and he saved their houses, and the people kneeled and prostrated themselves. This is just the end. People kneeled is the end of the verse. Because remember, we're talking about in the beginning that Moshe, where are we? Vayikra Moshe in verse 21, Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, told them what to do. And he gives them his whole speech. And he basically says, remember, we're still in Egypt. We have pressing problems. He says, Paschal offering. And in the future, tell your sons will ask and tell them the story. Excuse me. You see what I'm saying? That's right at the foundation of the story. Right even before we leave Egypt, he's already telling you how to preserve the story, how to preserve the message. So that's interesting. So at the end, the people here, they kneel and they prostrate themselves. They're happy and they go home and they do what God said. But before that, the beginning of the verse, you shall say. Now, seemingly, the simple way of reading it is 27 is response to 26. It will come to pass if your children say to you, and you shall say, meaning say to them. But the commentaries point out that it's specific now. Okay. There's another problem. The other problem is that the response in the Haggadah is not the response in this verse. So that's another separate problem. But there's a very interesting angle that says like this. This 27 you shall say is not a response to your children, at least not to the wicked child, at least not directly. Why am I saying that? So again, let's look at the other 4 times where it says your child will ask, or where it says tell the story. In those times it says say to them. It says so explicitly. Your child will ask, and you shall say to him or say to them, depending on the context. So it's explicit that you're speaking to them. 27, it doesn't say you shall say to him or you're to them. Your children will say to you. Meaning, in somehow 27 is separate than 26. In other words, in some ways, 27 is you have to declare and tell the story about what you're doing, regardless if your child is listening. Because the rebellious child may not be listening at this point. But it's still important to tell the story, because even if they're not listening now, you're going to plant the seed and eventually they will hear. So that's a very interesting thing. Sometimes a person asks a question, and when a person asks a question, especially when they're making a statement, the job is not to respond to them directly because they're not open. But nevertheless, this is what you say. You declare your values, regardless if they're going to accept it. And you don't even have to necessarily say it to them directly, because maybe they're not willing to hear at this point. but you still have to articulate your values. And that's what it seems to be saying here when he says, V'amartem, you shall say, you shall declare. And maybe 26 and 27 is disconnected. So maybe the Torah doesn't tell us what to respond to the wicked child. And that's why the sages come up with their own interpretation. Because there is no answer here to the child. Because the Torah understands that sometimes they're not listening. And that will explain why the sages in the Haggadah, their answer is basically totally provocative. It's totally not trying to convey information or persuade. It's meant to shake. Because when a person is not listening, you've got to shake them up. But so then what's the Torah telling here? Torah is telling you in general. Your child may ask, know that your child was going to ask, know there's going to be a gap between the people who experienced Egypt and didn't, and we have to do what we can to bridge that gap. And also know that you declare, you speak your values. If they're listening or they're not, that doesn't matter. So that's one way of thinking about it. One more way of thinking about it is, in other words, one more detail. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, I was just thinking maybe just declaring your values is just to leave those values so they learn by example.
Yeah, that too. And that's what he says. Ba'amartem. What is he saying? You're explaining what you're doing, right? Zevach Pesachul Hashem. This is a Pesach sacrifice to the Lord, right? In other words, you're declaring your values as you're doing. And maybe one way, and I'm sorry, you're right. You're right. I don't have my notes open. You're right. It's possible that what it means is the way you say it is by the practice. Right? In other words, sometimes by doing, that's how you communicate. And that's what we actually say in the Haggadah. In the Haggadah, we say, there's a passage toward the beginning, not right in the beginning, so not everybody knows this, but toward the beginning, it says, you would think maybe you could start telling the story from the 1st of Nisan, from the Rosh Chodesh. And he says, well, no, I have to do it that day, because it says Bayom Hazeh. If it's Bayom Hazeh on this day, maybe it's the morning of a Passover Eve, maybe it's the morning, the day before Passover. So he says, no, it says Bavur Zeh, this, and this means you point. This means you can only tell the story when you have the matzah and the bitter herbs. In other words, it sounds like the Torah says tell the story, but when should you tell the story? I'm busy the night of Passover. I'm too busy eating my matzah. So I'll start telling the story 2 weeks early. So the Haggadah says, no, you have to do it in that day. Not only that day, but at the Seder when you're eating matzah and bitter herbs. What is the sages really saying? What the sages are really saying is, the only way you're going to convey the story is by example. So if you want to say the story of Passover, just to say it as a story, there are many stories, and many cultures, and many stories. That's not going to have the impact. The impact is you're telling the story as you're doing the ritual. In other words, as you're you're living the values that you're talking about. And that may be what this is alluding to. You say this is a Pesach offering. You say it when you're doing it, because kids they listen less to what we say, they listen more to what we do. Not saying you don't have to articulate, you must articulate. That's clearly, this is the idea. You have to articulate. But articulation by itself is not the trick, is not going to do it. What made it last all these years is the practice and the articulation. That combination is the winning combination. Now we get to some theological questions about service to God. Also conversation here, if we look at the question and the answer. What is this service to you? Now, what does to you mean? It could have said, what is this service? Right? What is to you? Lachem. What's the response? And you shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord. So maybe that's the tension here. Maybe that's the conflict. Maybe the child or the wicked child is saying, what is the service to you? This is a service to you. Maybe he's defining it. The reason why it doesn't connect to it, because he's defining it as a service to you. And our response is, it's a service to the Lord. So this goes to a larger theological question. When we serve God, when we do the mitzvah, when we eat matzah on Passover, when we fast on Yom Kippur, what is this? Is it our own benefit or is it for God? And a deeper question is, part of this is that he's asking it about a sacrifice. And a Pesach sacrifice is not a sacrifice that you bring in the temple. I mean, later they brought in the temple, but that year, even when they brought in the temple, it was a sacrifice that the people consume. So it's basically a 4th of July barbecue. It's a barbecue celebrating our independence. That's really what Pesach sacrifice is. It's a 4th of July barbecue. So the question is this 4th of July barbecue, why are you saying it is a service to God? It's for you. You're enjoying the meat. You're enjoying the sandwich. You're enjoying the steak. You're doing it for yourself. This is not for God. And it's a broader question about Judaism, because one of the problems with Judaism, and this relates to the holiday of yesterday, one of the problems of Judaism is that it seems, unlike many religions or many spiritual exercises or spiritual paths, it's very much connected to the material world. In other words, yesterday we got the Torah. How do we celebrate the getting of the Torah? You have to eat good food. Now it seems absurd. We're talking about something that is, we're trying to connect to something spiritual. And the way we celebrate it is we have to actually consume delicious food and enjoy. Now in America, it was always a thing, people eat a little dairy, but now in America, it gets out of hand. And the dairy goes, you have to eat ice cream and you have to have cheese blintzes and you have to have cheesecake. But that's how you celebrate the giving of the Torah. It's absurd. And by the way, if you want to stop for a second, there is a Talmudic debate about holidays in general. The problem with the holidays is, what are you supposed to do with your free time on a holiday? So there are two verses about two different holidays. One verse says, Atzeret LaHashem Elokecha. It's a stop. You take a stop. You take a break for the Lord your God. And another verse, it says, Atzeret Elachem. It's an Atzeret, it's a stop, it's a holiday, it's a time to take a break for you. So the Talmud says, is it for God or is it for you? And then there was a debate. How do you interpret this verse? One rabbi says, it's up to you. You have the choice. You can use it, you could dedicate the day to God, or you could dedicate the day to yourself. In other words, you can use it as a spiritual holiday, time to study, a time to pray, or you can use it for a food and festival, food and drink, and a good barbecue with your family. And that's what Rabbi Eliezer says. You could do one or the other. And the other rabbis say, no. The reason why the Torah uses both, it's a holiday for God and a holiday for you, is because every holiday has to have both. On a holiday, you have extra time, so you're supposed to study and pray. So that's for God. But it's also for you because you must enjoy yourself and you must eat meat and good food, etc. So that's the Talmudic debate. We know the law. The law is you have to do both. But what's interesting about this debate is the Talmud says that everybody agrees that the Shavuot, the holiday that we receive the Torah, you also must have pleasure for yourself, for your body. That there's no debate. Nobody thinks that you could just be totally spiritual on Shavuot. Why? Because that's the whole theme of the Torah. The whole theme of the Torah is to sanctify the physical. So now if you're the wicked child, quote unquote wicked, whatever that means, and you're saying, what is this service to you? What are you talking to me about serving God? You're not serving God. I see you getting together. I see you eating steak. I see you having a good time. What are you blaming God for? You're saying I have to come to the Passover Seder to eat the roast. You're coming for the roast. You're not coming for the service of God. And what do we respond? We respond, no. We respond, the next verse, which is what the answer is. Martam, and you say, this is a sacrifice for the Lord. And how do we know it's for the Lord? How do we know that the Lord cares about this? Because we see what happened. He passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, and he saved our houses. In other words, all this it's not just for us. This is what God wants, and because we ate this sacrifice, that's why God saved us. In other words, the idea of sanctifying the physical is not something we're coming up with. This is exactly what God wants. This is the purpose of creation. So in other words, what the sages are trying to do, what the commentators are trying to do is, in this conversation between verse 26 and verse 27, there's a lot of philosophy and theology of what is the purpose of the whole enterprise we call Judaism. Is it just for us, or is it for God? And what's the whole point of Judaism? How could you say if it's for God, if there's so much focus on how we should live and how we could experience the pleasures of the physical world in a sanctified way? That doesn't seem as a spiritual exercise. And our response is we insist this is a sacrifice to God. This is what God wants. So that debate is ongoing between, and not even if within Judaism, the debate is settled, but the idea of that this is sometimes hard for other spiritual seekers to accept within Judaism, we understand that because it's not an easy sell. What we're doing is somehow paradoxical, that what God wants most is not necessarily spirituality per se, but that the spirituality impact and sanctify the physical, and therefore, if you can eat and enjoy and have that as be something that is going to enhance your connection to God and your connection to transcendence, that is the ultimate goal. And that's the sometimes in some way paradoxical claim and statement of Judaism that is sometimes hard for people to accept, sometimes hard for us to accept, but nonetheless, we've been saying it for a very long time, going back to that very first Passover Seder when we were still in Egypt. Yeah. So that's a little bit about about the sun. And again, the application is what when we're asking a question means being open, not making statements. So we can apply that to interpersonal relationships as well. A lot more to say, but we'll move on a little bit. Okay, what happens is midnight, came to pass at midnight. The Lord smote every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sits on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who is in the dungeon, and every firstborn animal. So this is very interesting. What happens is that the firstborns of the Egyptians were all killed. Now, why? Why were they killed? What did they do wrong? So it's easy to think of it as a punishment because the firstborn of the Egyptians, the firstborn class, the Bechor, the firstborn is this in some sense the privileged class. So obviously they have a lot of power in Egypt. They're very connected to the hierarchy of the system of Egypt, of the oppression of the Jewish people and the economy and the system. So if you have to smite the Egyptians and you don't want to kill everybody, it would make sense to kill the firstborn. That makes sense. But what about the people who have no power at all? What he's saying here, it's so starting, it goes all the way up and down the hierarchy. The firstborn die, right? So from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on his throne. Now, this is not clear. Does it mean Pharaoh's son? Or does it mean Pharaoh himself was the firstborn? Well, if Pharaoh himself was the firstborn, clearly Pharaoh didn't die. But it will explain why Pharaoh was so shaken. So it could be Pharaoh's son, or it could be Pharaoh himself was now threatened because he's a firstborn. To the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and every firstborn animal. Captive in the dungeon has no power in that system. And yet the firstborn dies. Every firstborn dies. And every firstborn animal. What did the animals do wrong? Right? Clearly, they didn't do anything wrong. So that's what happens. And later, this story is going to be reflected later in the chapter 13 about the mitzvah of redeeming the firstborn son, and also the firstborn animal is holy. So we'll get to that when we get to that in chapter 13. But the question becomes, what's the point? What exactly happened here? And why would you say every firstborn? So there's not an easy answer for this. Maybe there is. I can't think of a practical, easy answer. But the mystics think about this, and they come to an interesting a theory. So the theory is like this. What does it mean? First of all, how does this process work? God appears and all the firstborn dies, because that's what it says here. It says, what does it say? Here, Hashem Hikah. Here it doesn't say how. It just says Hashem smat every firstborn. But when God is speaking to Moses, God gives a little bit more information. What does God say? I will pass through the land of Egypt on this night. I will smite every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and upon all the gods of Egypt I will break judgment, I the Lord. And we talked about this in the Haggadah. I will pass. God is not sending an angel, right? Not a seraph, not an angel, God himself. So the mystics say, what is happening here? How does this work that God passes and everybody dies? Like, we usually would attribute the punishment to the attribute of justice. In other words, God is punishing. But here, it seems like just the fact that God passes through, everybody is dying. So, like I said, it's not an easy thing to connect to or explain, but the mystics want to say something like this. What they want to say is like this. What happens if you have intense revelation of God and you are not prepared? It could be dangerous because it's overwhelming. So if there's an intense burst of spirituality or holiness and you are not a proper vessel, then what the Kabbalists would say, the vessels will shatter and you'll cease to exist. And you see this all over the place. Where do you see this? You see this, for example, the earliest place you see it with Moses. Moses was going back to Egypt, and he took his wife and his two sons. And with this story, a very strange story in the end of Exodus chapter 5, in the end of the first portion, if you remember that he's on the way to Egypt, he's at the Malon, he's at the inn. God sees him and God wants to kill him. And then she circumcises her son, his wife circumcises his son, and then he's saved. Why does God want to kill him? It's the most strange thing. God is negotiating with Moses for 7 days to go down to Egypt, and finally he's on the way down, and finally all of a sudden God wants to kill him. So that's one episode, one strange episode. Another episode you see is the death of the two sons of Aaron, which we've been talking about for a long time in the book of the third book of the Torah, book of Leviticus, because a lot of the commandments relate to that story. What happened in that story? Two people, the sons of Aaron, they're very holy, but they go into the Holy of Holies, they go into the most holy part of the temple, and they die. Why do they die? Fire comes out. What's really happening here? What's really happening here is, if there's intense holiness and you are somehow not prepared for that, you're going to die. And they say, for example, that the high priest, when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, there was a lot at stake, because if they weren't righteous, they would die. And the tradition is that, this is very interesting. If you don't know this, it's interesting. The tradition is that in the era of the Second Temple, once the Romans took over Israel, and for the last 100 years when the temple still stood, people would pay the Roman governor to appoint them as a high priest, because it was a great honor. And they would go into the Holy of Holies, and they would die within the year. And yet they would still pay because they still wanted to become the high priest. So in other words, if you go to a place where there's intense holiness, the danger is that you're not going to survive. So when you say, what happens when God comes out in the land of Egypt? What happens when God comes out in the land of Egypt? That anybody who is not worthy of this revelation is going to expire. And that applies to so it's not a question of were they righteous or not righteous, because the firstborn of the captives who were in the prison in Egypt didn't do anything wrong. And they had no connection to the oppression of the Jewish people, but it does represent the fact that at certain moments you have to be prepared, spiritually prepared for events. Otherwise, when they come, you're overwhelmed. So that's what the mystics seem to say about this episode. Okay, now you have this whole conversation back and forth between the Egyptians and Pharaoh. Pharaoh wants the Jews to leave right away, and he says, "Get up and leave and go immediately." And they try to rush the Jewish people out of Egypt. You read that, for example, in verse 31. So he called Moses and Aaron at night and said, "Get up and get out from among my people, both you as well as the children of Israel, and go worship the Lord as you have spoken." And then in verse 33, so the Egyptians took hold of the people to hasten to send them out from the land, and they said, we are all dead. They were afraid they're all going to die. So the people, what do? They take their dough, and they go and they have the dough on the shoulder. They're ready to go. Now the Torah,
Yes, come in.
sorry, the Torah once again reiterates that the Jewish people now borrow the gold and silver from the Egyptians, which we spoke about. But if you just want a little bit of grammar, of Hebrew grammar, that I didn't know till recently, the question is, when did this happen? Verse 35, the children of Israel did according to Moses' order, and they borrowed from the Egyptians silver objects, golden objects, and garments. And the Lord gave the people favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they lent them, and they emptied out Egypt. The children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot. And then it talks about how they baked the bread. So the question is, when did they borrow the gold and silver from the Egyptians? If you read this, or the verses in order, it sounds like after midnight, after the Jewish people, after Pharaoh says leave, and the Jewish people have their dough, and they're ready to leave, then they went to borrow, because that's what it says, verse 35, the children of Israel did according to Moses' order, and they borrowed. But the commentaries say, at least some commentaries say, no, this verse 35 happened earlier. How do you know it happened earlier? And the children of Israel did according to the Moses' order. How do you know it happened earlier? So in Hebrew grammar, I didn't know this, usually it says the act before the person. Usually it would say, Vayasu bnei Israel. In English, you say the children of Israel did. But in Hebrew, you would say, did the children of Israel. You always put the act before the person. But the commentaries explain that's only for something that's happening in the present or the future. But if you put the name of the person before the verb, that means it happened in the past. So here it says, Ubnei Yisrael asu, the children of Israel did. When did they do? In the past. So this doesn't translate into English, but in Hebrew it's very clear, right? Vayasu bnei Yisrael is like, for example, Vayisu bnei Yisrael. The children of Israel journeyed. That's how they translate it. But in biblical Hebrew, you would say, journeyed the children of Israel. That's just the way it works. You always have the verb before the name. But over here, you have the name before the verb. It's because it happened in the past. So this solves all kinds of problems, because at this point the Jews knew they're going out, they're not coming back. So what was their intention? Did they intend to borrow or intend to return? We litigated this issue, but it helped. But for some people, it helps to say that they actually borrowed before the 10th plague. And to do that, you have to you have this interpretation that if you have the name before the verb, it means that it happened in the past. Okay. One last thing we want to talk about before we move to the conclusion of the chapter, maybe the conclusion of the class also, is the idea that the bread has no time to rise. So it's important to clarify like this. It's important. I don't know how much you want to get into this, but this was almost by mistake. In other words, they were not commanded to eat matzah. They were commanded to eat matzah when they were in Egypt for that Seder, for that first night. But the next day, it almost happens by itself. And why is it so important to emphasize that it happened by itself, or even more? If you go back to the beginning of chapter 12, I don't mean to be confusing, but I'll try to say this without all the details. Essentially, the first time God tells Moses about Passover, he says, it was a one-time thing. You eat matzah once. This year, the first year, you eat matzah one day. When do you eat matzah? At that Seder at night when they were still in Egypt. And then he says, you're going to do this in the future. But in the future, when you do it, you're going to do it for 7 days. Why are we going to do it in the future for 7 days? Doesn't say. In retrospect, we know. The reason why we did it for 7 days is because they didn't only have matzah one day. They had matzah for many days because when they left, the dough didn't have time to rise, so they ended up eating matzah. But that first time around, the Jewish people didn't know that. You see what I'm saying? So the first time around, they thought it's only a one-day event. This time, there was one-day commandment, eat matzah for today. And we knew in the future it's going to be 7 days, but they didn't really know why. The reason why it's going to be for 7 days is because it happened the way it developed when they left, the bread did not have time to rise. And this, again, tells you that when it comes to the moment of redemption, you're not always prepared. And taking advantage of the freedom of the opportunity requires doing something even though you're not fully planned. In other words, like this, when am I going to grow? When am I going to change? The answer is when I'm ready. That's what I think. If that's what I think, I'm never gonna take the next opportunity because I'm never gonna be fully ready. So what the Torah is telling you is that when the Jewish people leave, they leave with the awareness that we're not ready to go. So why are we going? Because the opportunity presented itself. But we're not fully ready. You'll never be fully ready. So the awareness of freedom is to understand that you'll be willing to make the step and willing to take a dramatic step, even though you're not fully ready. You have to be. So now I want to connect it to what I said before. You have to be ready for opportunity. You have to prepare yourself because if you don't, you'll be like the firstborn Egyptian, where when a massive change happens or when there's a tremendous intense energy happening, it's just going to be overwhelming, right? That they die because it's too much energy, it's too much holiness. So of course you have to prepare yourself. But the point is, you cannot say, "I'll make the move when I am ready," because you will never be ready. And that's built into the story that freedom is: we go out, we have dough. But the dough does not have time to cook. So we have to rush out in the middle of the process. If you ask me, I'd rather stay another hour in Egypt so I can have some normal bread. But that's not freedom. That's not redemption. And for us, the lesson is that when we see opportunity, or we understand that it's time to make a change internally or externally, a person has to do it even though they didn't figure out every last detail of the plan, because it's very important to have a plan and prepare for the plan, but it's also very important to be flexible enough and say, this is an opportunity. I'm taking this step. I don't have it all figured out. Some of it I have figured out, but this is my window to physical or spiritual freedom. You're never going to be fully ready. Maybe that's the point. Okay, Ad Kan till here. Thank you all for joining. Everyone should have a wonderful day and wonderful weekend. Vicky, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. This is a beautiful idea and very important idea for us today and a beautiful way to end the class. But does it mean that some people did bake the matzah and those who didn't bake, Hashem will take care of that something naturally happens, then the matzah will be there?
Everybody baked matzah, but they didn't bake bread. What we're used to is I prepare my bread in a certain way. It has to taste good. It has to rise. And in Egypt, it's a very Egyptian thing to do. I think we discussed that. The concept of not necessarily bread per se, but the concept of making yeast. Well, yeast is a natural phenomenon, but the idea that they understood how to use the yeast for the bread, that's an Egyptian thing. So we've been for hundreds of years we've been making bread this way, and now Moses says it's time to go. What's a natural thing to do? Natural thing to do is I'm going to go. We'll leave in a few hours. But what happens is the people they pick up and they leave, and what are you going to do with the bread? We'll figure it out, and then they bake it on the way out, but without giving it time to rise. Either they baked it in very thin cakes on the desert floor, or they can get very hot there, or they use it coal. But the point is, they did not have time. They did not have time to rise, and that was like unusual. It was a very unusual way of cooking bread, and it looks like a detail, but the Torah is emphasizing this and saying this is not a detail. This is an essential part of the story. So why is this so important to the story? What they ate? What do I care what they ate? If you say I'm taking a trip and I'm going to Australia, the first question I ask is, really? Are your bagels ready? Do you have enough food? It seems like a strange point to emphasize on. And we talked about this where you're putting the lens of the camera, and the lens of the camera keeps coming back to the scene, and not just in Exodus 12, but also throughout all of history. When we tell the story at the Passover Seder, we keep mentioning these verses that the people went out and the bread didn't have time to rise, and they went out anyway. So what is the emphasis? The emphasis is you make the move even though you're not fully ready.
Beautiful.
And-
All we need to do just make the first step, and
Right,
Hashem, hope
right.
that Hashem will do the rest. Beautiful.
Right,
Thank you.
right. And but sometimes the first step is Hashem gives us the opportunity, and then whether or not we take it is up to us. Right. So I think that's very powerful. Okay, thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful day. And sorry for going a few minutes over, but everyone should have a wonderful day. We see each other in good health, God willing.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.